It is November 1937, and inside a cramped factory on Lafayette Street in Lower Manhattan, a quiet inspector named Herman Lang lingers at his workbench long after the other men have gone home. Under a single hanging bulb, he unrolls a set of technical drawings and begins to copy them line by line into a small notebook. Nobody stops him. Nobody even questions him. He works for the Carl L. Norden company, and the drawings in front of him belong to the most closely guarded machine in the American arsenal, a device the United States believes can drop a bomb into a pickle barrel from 4 miles up. Lang finishes his notes, slides them into his coat, and walks out into the cold New York night. He has just given away America's most secret weapon, and nobody in Washington has the faintest idea. What happens next unfolds over 4 remarkable years, and it ends not with a single arrest, but with 33 of them, carried out in a single coordinated sweep that the Federal Bureau of Investigation would call the largest espionage roundup in the country's history. At the center of the story sits an ordinary, unassuming German immigrant who could easily have vanished into the machinery of Nazi intelligence, but instead chose to become one of the most effective double agents America ever produced. This is the story of how a stolen bombsight, a fake Manhattan office, a two-way mirror, and one man's quiet courage combined to dismantle an entire enemy spy network before the United States had even entered the war. It matters because it shows, in astonishing detail, exactly how close America's most protected secrets came to walking straight out the front door, and how a young, understaffed FBI learned to fight back. To understand why this was possible at all, we have to go back to a country that, in the 1930s, had almost no defenses against this kind of infiltration. Through most of the interwar years, the United States treated domestic counterespionage as an afterthought. There was no dedicated peacetime tradition of hunting foreign agents on American soil, no large trained corps of counterintelligence officers, and precious little legal machinery for prosecuting espionage that fell short of outright sabotage. Germany, by contrast, had spent years building precisely the kind of network America was unprepared for. Under the direction of Abwehr officer Nicholas Ritter, German military intelligence had assembled dozens of agents across the United States, embedded in aircraft plants, shipping companies, and defense contractors, quietly gathering blueprints, production figures, and shipping schedules and funneling them back to Berlin. The scale of the vulnerability was staggering. Recruits held ordinary jobs that gave them access to extraordinary information. One ran a Manhattan restaurant and pumped his customers for gossip about military shipments. Another worked for an airline and tracked convoys crossing the Atlantic. Still others used delivery routes as cover for passing sealed messages across the city. None of them needed to break into anywhere. They simply needed to keep their eyes open and their mouths shut. And the FBI, still finding its feet as a counterintelligence agency, had almost no way of knowing they existed. When Herman Lang copied those bombsight drawings in 1937, there was, quite simply, nobody watching him at all. The paperwork depended entirely on trust, and trust, it turned out, was not nearly enough. Something had to change, and the change would arrive from the most unlikely of sources. That something was a mild-mannered German-American named William Sebold, born in Mulheim and a naturalized United States citizen since 1936. Sebold traveled home to Germany in February 1939 to visit his ailing mother, only to be approached almost immediately by Nazi intelligence officers who pressed him into service through intimidation and thinly veiled threats against his family. Sebold pretended to agree. Then, before leaving Germany, he quietly told American consular officials in Cologne exactly what had happened. When he returned to the United States in 1940, the FBI was waiting, and together they built one of the most elaborate deception operations of the entire war. The Bureau helped Sebold set up a small consulting office in Manhattan, ostensibly for a diesel engineer working under the cover name Harry Sawyer. Behind its ordinary walls, agents installed hidden microphones and a two-way mirror, allowing them to film and record every conversation that took place inside. For 16 months, German agents filed in and out of that office, believing they were speaking to a trusted contact, while cameras rolled silently behind the glass. At the same time, the FBI operated a shortwave radio station that Sebold had been given by his German handlers, using it to feed Berlin a careful diet of true but useless information, while harvesting genuine intelligence about German operations across the Western Hemisphere. Every visit, every payment, every scrap of stolen material passed, unknowingly, straight into the Bureau's files. That radio link and that hidden office were the practical mechanism of the entire operation. But the prize the Germans had been chasing from the very beginning was the Norden bombsight itself. And it is worth understanding just how extraordinary a piece of engineering it truly was. Designed by the Dutch-born engineer Carl Norden, the device weighed around 20 kilograms, roughly the weight of a large dog, yet packed more than 2,000 individual components into its casing. It combined a gyroscopic stabilizer, essentially a set of spinning wheels that resisted the aircraft's pitching and rolling, with an optical telescope and a mechanical analog computer built from cams, gears, prisms, and mirrors. Feed it the aircraft's altitude, airspeed, and the crosswind, and it would calculate the precise release point for a bomb and, remarkable for its time, physically fly the aircraft during the final approach through a linked autopilot, holding the plane dead level, while the bombardier held only a set of crosshairs steady on the target. Norden's factory on Lafayette Street built roughly 800 units a month by the early 1940s, a production run that eventually cost well over $1 billion across the life of the program, a sum comparable to the entire Manhattan Project. Every device was treated with almost theatrical secrecy. Bombardiers swore an oath to protect it and were trained to destroy it with a thermite charge or a pistol shot rather than let it fall into enemy hands intact. Between missions, it was locked away under armed guard in secure vaults and carried to the aircraft under canvas. And all the while, thanks to Hermann Lang, the Germans had already possessed a working knowledge of its design since 1938, paid for the plans with a few thousand Reichsmarks, and had smuggled hand-copied sketches out of the country aboard an ocean liner years before the first American bomb ever fell on Europe. If you are finding this interesting so far, a quick subscribe helps more than you know, and it means you will not miss what happens when the Bureau finally decides to move. By June 1941, the FBI's evidence gathered patiently through Sebold's wired office and the monitored radio traffic was overwhelming. Agents moved simultaneously across several states, arresting Hermann Lang, along with the Ring's aging Boer war-scarred leader, Fritz Duquesne, and 31 others in a single coordinated sweep. 19 pleaded guilty rather than face the mounting pile of recorded evidence. The remaining 14, including Lang, stood trial that autumn and were convicted regardless. By December 13, 1941, just 6 days after Pearl Harbor, every member of the Ring had been dealt with, and America's homeland network of German intelligence agents had effectively ceased to exist overnight. Meanwhile, out over occupied Europe, The bombsight Lang had betrayed continued flying combat missions aboard waves of B-17S. Its elaborate secrecy protocols still solemnly observed by crews who had no idea the Germans had studied its blueprints for years. It is worth placing this achievement alongside what Britain and Germany were doing at the same time, because the contrast is instructive. Britain's own domestic security service, MI5, was simultaneously running its celebrated double-cross system, turning captured German agents into channels for feeding false information back to Berlin, a technique remarkably similar in spirit to Sebold's wired Manhattan office, though refined across an entire national network rather than a single storefront. Germany, for its part, never actually deployed the Norden's stolen secrets to any real advantage. Luftwaffe engineers who examined the smuggled plans judged the design too complicated and too fragile for mass production, and committed instead to dive bombing tactics that made a precision, high-altitude site largely irrelevant to their doctrine. Even Germany's own equivalent instrument, the Luftfernrohr 7, though broadly similar in concept, was assessed by Allied technicians after the war as inferior in its optics to the American original. In other words, one of the most sensitive thefts in American history achieved remarkably little for the country that committed it, while the counter-espionage operation built to stop further leaks proved decisive. The material impact of the Duquesne Ring's exposure is, in truth, difficult to measure with precision. Historians still debate how much operational damage the network genuinely caused before its collapse, and some of what German intelligence received back through Sebold's radio was, by design, carefully engineered to mislead rather than inform. What is not in doubt is the psychological impact. One German intelligence officer later admitted, in a phrase that has echoed through the decades since, that the roundup delivered the death blow to Nazi espionage efforts on American soil, and FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover called it the greatest spy operation of its kind the Bureau had ever mounted. The 33 convicted agents were sentenced, collectively, to more than 300 years in prison. Sebold himself, his usefulness spent, and his exposure now a mortal danger, disappeared into an early version of witness protection and lived out his remaining years far from the city, where he had once filmed Nazi spies through a pane of ordinary-looking glass. The legacy reaches further than the courtroom. The Sebold operation demonstrated conclusively and publicly that patient, technically sophisticated surveillance, rather than dramatic raids or torture, was the most effective tool against organized espionage, a lesson the Bureau and its allied counterparts would apply again and again through the long decades of the Cold War that followed. And the Norden bombsight itself outlived both the scandal and the secrecy that surrounded it. Declassified by 1944, once its details were already common knowledge among the enemy, surviving examples can today be seen in the National Air and Space Museum in Washington, the National Museum of the United States Air Force in Ohio, and the Computer History Museum in California. Silent reminders of a machine so precious that grown men swore oaths to destroy it, and so thoroughly compromised that the oaths, in the end, protected nothing at all. Return, for a moment, to that cold Manhattan evening in November 1937, to a single inspector alone beneath a hanging bulb, copying secrets that would travel 4,000 miles before anyone in Washington noticed they were gone. That is where this story begins, with a theft nobody caught, in a system built on nothing sturdier than trust, and it is worth sitting with the distance between that moment and the one that follows it 4 years later, when 33 men and women who had built an entire intelligence network on American soil discovered all at once that the trusted contact they had been meeting in a rented Manhattan office was never their friend at all, that Every word they had spoken had been filmed through a mirror they had looked into 100 times without ever seeing what lay behind it. Hermann Lang stole a secret that Germany never truly used. William Sebold built a trap that Germany never saw coming. One man's betrayal opened the door, one man's courage closed it, and locked 33 others inside with it. The bombsight kept flying, the war kept going, and the network that had once reached into aircraft plants and shipping offices across the country was gone within a single afternoon in the summer of 1941. It stands, even now, as one of the quietest, most patient victories of the entire war. No explosions, no headlines at the time, just a hidden microphone, a two-way mirror, and an ordinary man who decided one morning in Cologne that he would rather serve his adopted country than the one demanding his loyalty. That decision cost Nazi Germany its most effective spy ring in America. It is, in the truest sense, the story of how silence, patience, and one quiet act of defiance did more damage to Hitler's intelligence network than almost anything else achieved on American soil during the entire war.